Hello everyone, as always I'm Vlad Sparastoria and I know things about shooting. Today I'm once again at the National Shooting Range of Legnano where I'm taking a look at this beautiful Webley. 1908, English semi-automatics are a bit forgotten pistols. If we think a bit about the international scene, everyone can point out a German semi-automatic, they can find an Italian semi-automatic, and of course they can find an American semi-automatic. But not many people, if I ask them to tell me the name and models of some English semi-automatic, can do it. That's because this type of weapon, essentially until 1945, remained a bit of a niche in the United Kingdom. Only with World War II did the English army and police forces truly become convinced of this technology. And especially during the years of the war, the FN, with the genius of Diodone and Sev, will evacuate to the United Kingdom, and many other engineers from other nations will work there. So there will be a large pool of technicians and intellectuals who will give a big boost. Until that moment, however, the only real English semi-automatic pistols to see the light and come onto the market were these Webley. First of all, when we talk about the Webley self-loading, these Webley self-loading pistols, we're talking about a family of pistols. Because there were many of them, different models, and the design, if we look at these models, has a very clear evolution. What we're looking at today is the 1908 model, the most widespread of all. A variant of this pistol is easy to spot from a distance because its sight attachment differs slightly from this one. Here it was adopted by the Metropolitan Police, the London Police, until 1940. They were issued this weapon, which made it the most popular one overall, also because it used a very common caliber, the 7.65 Browning. But to better appreciate the history of this weapon, and especially to understand how some of its mechanical oddities ended up on this model, we obviously need to take a step back in time to what is actually the first self-loading pistol developed in the kingdom. First of all, let's remember something very important. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, the self-loading pistol was something completely new. The first commercially successful pistol, or rather, the first one produced in series and not just as prototypes, was the C93 Borchardt, which, as the number suggests, was produced and patented in 1893. So, the technology was very new from this point of view and at the turn of the two centuries. In 1900, there weren't many self-loading pistols that came out at that time. Militarily speaking, the only feasible ones, the only ones that could be used, were the C96. The Luger was still being developed, and really, there was almost nothing else. But there was a guy named John Moses Browning who did something brilliant, as you should know, because I basically tell you every time I introduce you. These early 20th century pocket pistols created a new type of weapon, the FN 1900, which opened up a huge market for pocket pistols. These pocket pistols were much simpler mechanically than a pistol with a locking system suitable for military use. So, while military pistols were still struggling to be developed, pocket pistols gave rise to a huge market and many companies. But going back to military pistols, in 1900, an English gentleman named Hugh Gabbett Fairfax patented and went on to build a monstrosity, an extremely strange, extremely large, and extremely powerful pistol. He didn't have the means to build it. He was an inventor, but without the necessary skills. So he turned to an English arms company, Webley, to have prototypes made. They built about 80 of them, in various calibers of immense power. The Mars, that's what this pistol was called, became somewhat famous thanks to video games like Battlefield 1. It would be a complete failure. As for military adoption, the English army that tested it was disgusted. That's almost quoting the words they used. It was too powerful. They described it as an experience. Its use was unpleasant. But after all, the ammunition it used was much more powerful, for example, than the .357 Magnum, to say something exaggerated, a bit much for military use, besides the weight and size. Not to mention the poor reliability of the weapon. I told you that he turned to Webley to produce it because he simply didn't have the machinery or the necessary industrial capabilities to go from the drawing, the design, the patent, to actually building a weapon. In the history of firearms, as in the history of many different inventions, we often remember the name of the patent holder or the person who commercially puts their name on it. And we often forget about those companies, those engineers who actually made a project possible by refining a design and setting up a production line. And the one who set up the production line for the Mars was an engineer named William Whiting, better known as Bill Whiting. And even though Bill Whiting's name basically never appears in all these designs, or rather it appears in the patents, but we certainly don't remember him. Bill Whiting would be, for decades, the mind behind so many designs. In name, Webley, in addition to being responsible for putting these Mars prototypes into production, was, for example, responsible for the revolvers. Here we have a beautiful Webley Mark IV, which we have also featured on the channel, and this one is also signed by Bill Whiting. Another very famous thing that Bill Whiting did, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, is the Webley. Fosbury, here too, an inventor named Fosbury, came up with the idea of making a self-loading revolver. Maybe you know it again from video games like Battlefield 1. The person who actually adapted this design onto a Webley frame and put it into production was once again Bill Whiting. And what Bill Whiting had to do was adapt this completely unsuitable for military use design of the Mars pistol and turn it into something appealing for the British Army. Thus began a series of incremental development work and patents that gradually took this old Mars design. They changed it, they modified it according to what were ergonomic and military needs. The weapon he went on to design had various iterations, all of them incremental. Perhaps the most interesting thing that Bill Whiting would go on to do in what would later become, in 1911, the Webley self-loading Mark I, a large military pistol that, however, had little success. And he came up with the idea of having a barrel that moved diagonally, but it had the feature that it locked against the slide in the ejection port. Think about it for a moment. If you consider all those pistols, for example, like the Glock, like the SIG-26, and practically every modern semi-automatic except for the Beretta with a tilting block, almost all of them very often lock this way, in the ejection port. This feature, along with the Browning system, is called the Sig Sauer system, developed in 1975. However, the idea of using the ejection port as a locking lug didn't come from Sig. The first one to do this was actually Bill Whiting. With Webley, however, the development of this military pistol was slow and difficult, and the British Army was not convinced. Other interesting designs were emerging from other parts of the world. And let's emphasize one thing. Webley had money problems, even though until 1903, with the Second Boer War, it was making a lot of profits and money. When the taps of war are turned off, arms companies start to suffer. However, at that time, one thing was thriving. The civilian market I mentioned earlier, opened by the FN 1900. So at Webley, they decided to adapt, shrink, and simplify the design. What was becoming a Marshall pistol to turn it into a pocket pistol? Thus, the Webley 1905 was born, first of all, in 7.65, Browning a pistol that from a distance actually looks very similar. This one, even though it had some additional mechanical complications, was still quite sophisticated. A very peculiar thing, we can see it clearly now as we move the camera. This pistol has a rather strange way of being disassembled. In fact, it's a legacy from the 1905 pistols, which had a bizarre system essentially to cushion and dampen the recoil. By the way, many of the oddities that we will find on this pistol are actually the result of the development of that military model. Of course, I'll let you know when that's the case. The 1905 pistol was a bit too complicated. And in 1908, Billy Whiting returned to the design. In the meantime, he had been in the United States for patent matters, to file patents there as well. And after returning from the United States, he went on to simplify this design. He also simplified it by taking inspiration from the work of one of his employees. While he was in the United States between 1906 and 1907, he also made a version in 6.35 Browning, also known as .25 automatic Colt pistol. What came out of this was the so-called Model 1908, which was famously adopted a few years later. And so it was built in thousands and thousands of units by the Metropolitan Police, who would use these pistols, again, very similar to this one, except for a small difference in the sight mount and the markings. They would use them until 1945. So let's do this. Let's finally move the camera, because it's a bizarre weapon. I'll just say this. The Webley and its shape are definitely unique. To the modern eye, it looks a bit strange. To some, it might resemble designs like the Luger or the P-38 because of its exposed barrel, but in reality, it has nothing to do with them, with this weapon. Instead, if we look closely, let's maybe put an image here of a Mars pistol. We see some definite similarities, the hammer and many small features that, if analyzed, remind us of it. I repeat, it comes from that design. Now let's look at the markings. So first of all, we have the name of the factory, Webley Scott Limited, London, Birmingham. 7.65 and 32 refer to the caliber known in the United States as automatic pistol, which is the 7.65 Browning. Then we have an indication of the safety. And by the way, one of the first funny things about this weapon is that the safety works the opposite way from what we would expect. That is, a modern shooter, if he approaches this weapon, sees it like this and thinks it's ready to fire, while if we pull it up, it's on safe. It's exactly the opposite. The weapon is ready to fire with this lever up, while with this lever down, where the word safe appears, it's not safe. Let's see, very nice, so cute. The Webley ampersand sun logo, which by the way, I don't know if you can see it, but this here is a mini ball, literally a cross-section of a mini ball. Wonderful, we obviously have the serial number. The other side is generally bare, except for the Birmingham Proof House stamp. The Metropolitan Police pistols are easily recognizable because first, they have Metropolitan Police written on them, and second, if we look at the sights, the Metropolitan Police. The most prominent feature is the lanyard ring, since these were sold as pocket pistols. At the time, these personal defense weapons were carried in the pocket. And here, a rear sight notch, or other prominent things can get caught inside, for example, in pockets. While a police officer, who typically uses a holster, can afford, so to speak, a protruding notch. This is essentially the reason for the difference. The rear sight notch. You see, this milling on the slide isn't really ideal. You can't see the sights very well, but for self-defense at a few meters, it's more than enough. The front sight is attached to the barrel and is round to prevent it from snagging on clothes or pockets when drawn. The large hammer, obviously single action, blocks us. By the way, can you see the sights when it's not cocked? But if I cock it, by the way, it's one of the stiffest hammer springs we've ever seen on a pistol like this. Can you see? The sights aren't exactly huge, but for self-defense purposes, they're enough, along with the only other controls, as we've seen. There's the safety, which right now, as you can see, prevents the gun from firing, while in the counterintuitive position, meaning up, it releases the firing mechanism. Then we have the magazine with a special release, because it's the European style, meaning it's at the bottom here of the grip at the base of the guard. But you just need to press this button and our magazine comes out. The real oddities of the weapon start if we take a look at how it's made inside. To better appreciate the mechanical features, we need to do a few things. Besides disassembling it for cleaning, we'll also need to remove the grips, because it's actually the grips that might be hiding the most interesting part of all, really. Of the weapon, let's cock the hammer, which helps us a bit with the disassembly, and put the weapon on safe. And now we need to take out the trigger guard in a way that's a bit reminiscent of, for example, the Walther PP. Except that we don't have a piece that comes out here, but we have to pull it out from here. There you go, you see how it comes out. This is a very interesting legacy from the Webley 1905. because in the Webley 1905, this element is a spring that comes out all together. And in the 1905, the barrel, for about 1 millimeter of travel, rests on this spring. In short, when it fired, the barrel as you can see, it comes out because it's for disassembly, but it could recoil by another millimeter and be dampened by this spring that acted as a buffer. Even from the trigger guard, you can tell there's not much to dampen with the 7.65 Browning. It's an unnecessary complication. So this function was abandoned, but this disassembly system, where the trigger guard holds the barrel in place, was kept. From this position, we can move the barrel. As you can see, it comes out up to a certain point, and then you simply pull the slide off the weapon. And we can separate the components. The slide is actually very simple, also because in the end, in quotes, it's just a semi-automatic in 7.65 Browning. So we have a slide milled from solid steel. We can clearly see the extractor and the pin that holds the extractor in place. We can also see, I hope it's visible with this light, where the firing pin comes out. In turn back here where the hammer strikes it. The barrel here is also very simple, nothing unusual about it. But look at how it's held in place. You see this part here, this one that almost wedges itself in. It fits into the special notch in the barrel. And when I open the trigger guard, as you can see, it lowers, which allows me to remove it very easily. The barrel and the slide. It's a bit unsettling that the entire barrel and slide are held by this little notch. Yes, it's a bit of a spring, it's a bit stiff, but I have the impression, well, there are better designs. I don't know if it pops out when shooting, I hope not, but it rests there. Everything comes down to this point. Here you'll be asking yourself something fundamental. We've done this field stripping for cleaning. And those of you who are interested in firearms will have a fundamental question. Where the heck is the recoil spring? Where is it? Well, this weapon, it doesn't have your typical recoil spring. It has a linear recoil spring. It has a V-spring hidden under the grips. Think about other pistols. Another pistol that does this very strange thing is the Beretta 950. We saw it in particular a few months ago on the channel. Why is that? This is another legacy of the development of the military pistol. At a certain point in 1904, so just before the release of these 1905 models, in particular, even before Bill Whiting invented the tilting barrel, he was essentially experimenting with a locking block that moved diagonally, a locking block that in its operation is very reminiscent of the so-called Bergmann systems. For certain similarities, we can also think of it in a broad sense like the system of the C96 of the Walther P38. The swinging block is the Beretta, but in any case, there was a block here that moved diagonally to complete the locking. The problem is that in that design, because of how that block was made, there was nowhere to put the recoil spring. And so they came up with the idea to hide the recoil spring on the side. Essentially, it works by going in this direction, we'll see it now, and it pushes on the slide to help it complete the closing. This legacy, let's say from that evolution, from that design, was carried over into the pocket version. He made it like this, he solved this problem very well, so why change things that work? So let's first remove the right grip. We just see a single screw. Obviously, you need to unscrew it and be very careful, because there are springs under tension underneath here. Let's try not to let anything pop out, also because it's easy for these springs to fly out. Now, my friends, you need to use a bit of imagination, because I don't intend to press on this spring, because putting it back in would be a nightmare. But as you can see, we have a V-shaped spring. Here is the spring, which in turn presses on this extension, which then fits into the slide. So this is how it connects to the slide. And that makes it constantly push forward. This is one of the reasons why this weapon cycles. This spring is particularly stiff. Honestly, classic spiral springs are a bit lighter in this regard. But it definitely does its job. It's definitely interesting because it stays hidden right under the grips here holding this spring, this one. It fits onto its own little pin. I'm not sure how well you can see it right now. Well, this one, as you can see, has the shaft, which is also the one for the screw. of the grip panel. And by the way, I don't want these springs to pop out. Let me put this grip panel back on. Anyway, I find this feature really interesting. Let me screw it in for a moment. Now let's unscrew the other one. Let's see why the other one. Actually, it hides the functioning of the shutter mechanism from us, which I also think is at least interesting. But I've never ruined CrossFit. Here you go. We notice its trigger with the drive bar, but we also notice how the safety works. In short, when the safety is on, the drive bar, as you can see, its movement is pushed down. See, safety on, safety off. The drive bar connects with this connector, which in turn acts on the sear so the weapon can fire. If we take the trigger, this happens. You see the trigger being pressed, so then the hammer obviously cycles back to recock. While that safety is physically engaged by this wedge below, which misaligns the drive bar so the weapon cannot fire. A very, very, very simple operating system, and it's interesting that it's easily accessible. From this side, by the way, you can also see the spring quite well from here. Let's reassemble everything very simply. Here we go. Let's put the grip back on. Let's put its screw in. Let's screw it in. Then we need to put the barrel back into the slide. As you can see, the barrel has this extension. You need to put it back into the slide, and then you can put everything back onto its rails. Here we are, also sliding it in, then the barrel. Let's see if we can do it. Perfect. Everything goes inside, and now you need to press it in a bit. Because if this part, here it is, if this part doesn't want to go into position, you shouldn't force it. Instead, you should press it in. And there it goes. It fits into place quite easily. Let's press it in. Here it is. There it clicked, and now the weapon is ready to be used. Very, very, very simple. Let's uncock the hammer. Here we go. Let's go try it out. And here we are on the shooting range at the Legnano Shooting Club, testing this Webley. Obviously, the caliber is 7.65 Browning. Let's insert the magazine. I'll tell you something, when the hammer isn't cocked, that spring we saw is really stiff because you also have to cock the hammer. And I think it's definitely one of the worst semi-automatics to rack. Even I struggle with it. You just need a bit of CrossFit, as you can see. Obviously, while doing this, I engage the safety, which rightly needs to be up. Let's see. Oops, it didn't recock. Damn it! My hands are sweating and I'm having trouble cocking this gun, damn it. Sometimes forgive her, but she's 100 years old. Ha ha ha. Bam. Yeah, poor thing. Unfortunately, it could also be this spring that hasn't been moved for such a long, long time. Bam. Okay, let's try one more time. And we should be done at this point, and in fact, we're done. So what should I tell you about the malfunctions? But I repeat, this might be the first time this weapon has fired after 100 years. By the way, on the outside it's probably intact, but the barrel inside is a bit damaged. So right now, I'm not even going to judge the result too much. But I'll tell you my first impressions, both the positives and the negatives. Strangely enough, it actually feels pretty good in the hand, in the sense that from a distance this grip looks terribly square and not very ergonomic. But I'll tell you, actually, I should try it with one hand, with two hands, but even with two hands, my hands fit pretty well, pretty comfortably. As for handling, the safety works, but it's a bit strange, because when I tried to rack the slide and get a good grip on it, I accidentally engaged the safety. That's not really ideal, kind of like the Beretta 90 series, but I'll tell you honestly, first place overall, definitely, first time in years. I shoot and do YouTube and similar things. Number one on the podium for the worst, the hardest slide that exists when the hammer is uncocked and forward. Racking this pistol requires muscles. Honestly, I'm having trouble, and I'm not exactly the smallest person. Let me try a few more times, okay? Perfect, let's rack it, okay? Let's see. Damn. My hand slips because of the strength it takes to rack it. I'm not exaggerating, I promise. This time I'm loading it. But I'll tell you something positive. Definitely the trigger. The trigger is very good, very crisp, very short. It's not super light. But I think we're out of rounds. Also, it doesn't go into hold open, so you have to get used to leaving the gun a bit closed. From this point of view, let's try again. Damn. Today, I don't even need to work out. Look, I'm sweating. Poor thing. I think we're out of shots. With this one, yes, we're out of shots. Ugh. Now, I repeat, if any of you comment on it, judge it for reliability. Remember, these are historical pieces that are very old and you will be arrested by the English police. Remember that nowadays you can be arrested just for opinions by the English police. So be careful what you say. Apart from that, I find it a very interesting historical piece because, I repeat, you don't see these around semi-automatic pistols. Coming from the United Kingdom, it's a bit of a very rare niche of firearms, represented almost exclusively by these pistols. So it was definitely a privilege and an honor to be able to try it, because it's nice to try different things. Thank you all for watching this video. As always, remember that you are the ones who make these videos. You, for example, like the owner of this firearm who offered to let me try it today. If you have interesting pieces, let me know. Write to me. That's exactly how my videos are born. If you'd like to help, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This, of course, is not just friendly advice, so do it if you want to contribute, for example, to support the channel, also because you don't really earn anything with YouTube. Consider, for example, subscribing and buying the t-shirts. You can show off to your friends at the shooting range. And you can know that I use that money well to create more content. From me, that's all for today. As always, I'll see you next time.